Hi, everyone. It's Donato Cabrera, and welcome back to this week's episode of MusicWise. We'll share this story, I'm sure, during this hour, but not too long after I became music director of the Las Vegas Philharmonic, I was so pleasantly surprised that one of my composer heroes actually lives right here in Las Vegas. And we developed a fast friendship, and since those, what was it, 5 or 6 years ago now, I've had such great fortune to conduct a few of Michael Torke's pieces, and will happily do so again in the future, I'm sure. But for this episode, we're going to focus on his latest release, a fantastic brand new composition called Being. And so, without further ado, welcome to MusicWise, Michael Torke.
Hi, thank you for having me, Donato. So glad to be here.
You know, I so vividly remember that dress rehearsal with our dear friend Joyce Yang. And in fact, I believe it was actually during my first season as music director, now that I think about it.
The Paganini variations, remember?
Of course, I do remember, because as I'm sure you're aware, that's a piece that gives conductors a little bit of sweat on the brow to conduct. There are a couple transitions that are always tricky, but regardless of the level of the pianist, of course, Joyce is one of the world's greatest pianists, but still there's a couple of those moments in that incredible piece by Rachmaninoff that, you know, gets my blood going a little bit. And at the end of the rehearsal, which was at the end of rehearsing the Rachmaninoff, which was the pause of the rehearsal, you were so kind to introduce yourself, and I was just really bowled over that someone of your stature was in the rehearsal, and you were the only one in the audience at the time, and I was just so excited to meet you, because I've been such a fan of your music for so many years, and yeah, let's tell us your path to Las Vegas. What brought you here? You spend half the year here, and at least, and probably this year's maybe a little more than most years. But you're a resident of Las Vegas, and you have been so for quite a few years. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate a little bit to tell. There's one version of the story which I tell, and why not? You know, I came to Las Vegas because of bed bugs.
Oh, I like this. I don't know if I've heard this version. I like this.
No, what happened was, I mean, I was familiar with Las Vegas. I have a friend who's a fellow Eastman pianist that I know from LA, and we used to meet up in the early aughts. And then my building in New York, I lived on Houston Street. I no longer live there, but I lived there for many, many years. And the building was hit. It's a very cosmopolitan building, a lot of Europeans coming through. It was hit with, this was like 2005 when bed bugs were hitting New York. I know it's disgusting. I can't even bear to say the word. And some of us I was freaked out. And I went 2 blocks away on Thompson Street and just walked in to a realtor, and I said, I need an apartment. And within like 10 minutes, I signed a lease on a studio apartment right across the street from where Carbone was first developed. Which is now a restaurant here.
And a restaurant that you love to take me to, by the way.
That's where we've gone for some great meals. And so anyway, about 6 months into it, I was talking to a woman in the building, and I was saying, yeah, well, I have this place to go. I have to come back and work during the day. The bed bugs don't come out. They only come out at night, and on and on. And I said, you know, for what I am paying for this rent, I could own a house in Las Vegas. And the light bulb went off. And I said, well, then why not? So when the lease was up, I got on a plane, flew out to Las Vegas, and like within one day, I signed the papers. I can be very impulsive in that way.
Well, as someone who has, we were talking before the show started, someone who has spent many an hour recently looking at various properties for purchase, pulling the trigger on buying properties often the way to go, because I feel like I'm just gun shy at the moment.
Yeah, maybe that's true. I mean, I tend to act in, I guess, creatively, I kind of just feel something and go with it. The one area where I've never done that is I've never pulled the trigger on marriage. And I once had a producer, Andrew Cornell, say, sometimes you just have to jump into the water. I just couldn't do it. But everything else, I could manage.
So, but you still split your time between here and New York City in a normal year, yes?
Yeah, right.
And I'm curious if that you're a full-time composer, and this is something that is for many people might be a unique way of a unique profession to understand. And I don't mean a full-time composer that may have a teaching position. That's an entirely different animal and an incredible way of life, of course. But you live through commissions, through commissions of your pieces. This is how you are. This is what you call yourself. And I'm curious, now that you sort of split your time between both cities to a certain extent, is one city more of a composing city than the other? Do you find that moving to Las Vegas changed your music? Maybe maybe talk about that, your way of life now, as it now affects composition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that historically it's always been that the cultural capitals of the world are a kind of a mecca for creative people. And it's not just that the most opportunities are there, but when you have everyone trying to get the crumbs from the king's table, there's a lot of talent that is all over the place, a lot of ideas just hanging out in New York or in LA or a city like that, or Berlin. You just come away every day with new ideas. I'm a person who needs a lot of stimulation. And so I was, after school was done, I moved right to New York. Then you get to a certain point where you want other things in life besides just that, I mean, go kind of pressured feeling. And I love the desert. So when I came out here, the thought was to get away from all of that, all of the pressures of New York, and have a place. My house here is on the edge of the desert. So, I mean, it's like a moonscape just a block away. And so that kind of is what happened. But, Las Vegas has its own stimulation, very different kind from New York. And I found that I was thriving on that just as much. But then I discovered it took a little while when I kind of opened it, because this was going to be the oasis where no one knew I was here and I wouldn't answer the phone. That didn't work out because I'm naturally a social person. And so when I opened up and I came to the Philharmonic, like to that rehearsal, or I have gone to other hang out with the professors from the university here and go to the restaurants, of which it's like a second New York here in Las Vegas. I've kind of come to have a whole new group of friends and people that I associate with, which I find just as enlightening and nourishing as New York. So it's worked out really well.
I want to focus, of course, on this newest release, but I do want to just touch upon a little bit about the transformation, the evolution, the journey that you've taken to being the newest. The release may not be of course, the latest composition you've had, but
well, I could talk about that a little bit vis-a-vis what you had asked me before about making a living as a composer. I mean, one way to think about it in a real simple terms is with a composition or any, for us, it's composing, it's our pieces. There's what we call front-end income, which would be like someone commissions us, or back-end income, which would be royalties. And at the beginning of my career, there were commissions that sustained me, and I was very grateful and lucky for that. The royalties were far and few between. I'm hearing music.
Sorry, that was my fault.
And maybe I'm boring. Maybe I should move along a little faster.
No, not at all. I just wanted to make sure things were as they should be. But anyway, no.
Yeah, and so So then the ultimate goal, besides making a living as a composer, which is a goal that I've always pursued and kept up in 35 years, is can you make the royalty stream strong enough so that you don't have to worry about hustle for or be pressured by commissions? Because commissions always tell you who you're writing for and what it should kind of be about, even in the loosest sense. Just write us anything, but it's got to be 16 minutes. It has to be celebratory. We got to do it not next year, but the following season. And then we own the rights for the recording. Oh, you have your own label, but no, we have another label we want to go with. And so my goal in my career, and it's just starting to happen now, and Being is the first purest example of this, is that the royalty stream said, I can take a year and write a piece that's completely impractical. Maybe it'll never be performed by anyone, but I'll get my musician friends from New York to record it. We will release this, and it'll be a creative statement of my vision of whatever that is. We can talk about that. And no one is going to tell me what to do. And that's how this came about.
I mean, in some ways, it's like a full circle, of course, because when you first start composing, even after school, you're still writing the pieces that are, based on pure inspiration to a certain, even if it's a commission. And then you get into that world of, well, we need a concert opener and it can only be double winds and all those things that you've just mentioned that are indeed a little handcuffs here and there. And so I'm curious then, indeed, that this new piece Being is sort of a coming around to the way of composing that you've probably imagined probably what you did at the very beginning.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that is always the goal, is that you have an idea and you want to realize the idea. And then if you're clever, you can have commissions kind of support that idea, and you talk the commissioners into your idea and all of that. But still, there are other things besides just the aesthetic issues. There are kinds of legal issues and rights that can handcuff whether a piece gets played by this group or that, because, well, we have exclusivity and no one else can do it. And all of these things, which can be very stressful. To me, this was a dream project because there was no one influencing any. And the other thing about it that was kind of pure was there's this producer, Silas Brown, who produced this album and several before that. He and I kind of saw the intended vision of this, which we can talk about. And we were so much on the same page that building this recording together was the kind of collaboration that you dream about, of just mutual respect going back and forth. I mean, we had just agreed on, we're very different musicians, but we tended to agree on how to mix it, how to edit it, what lines to bring out. I mean, that might sound like, well, isn't there just one line to bring out? But a lot of recording is very subjective. How you use reverb. You could get into fist fights with producers about reverb. And he and I just worked together really well. And that was a good feeling, especially during COVID. We worked hardest in May, June, and July. And we could put his studio, his board, through something called Clean Feed, something like a platform we're on, but it's high fidelity. So I could hear in my headphones exactly what he was hearing in his studio in New Rochelle, New York, even though I was here in Las Vegas.
That is absolute. What a gift, where we are in today's world of technology, that you that couldn't have been done probably 5 years ago, let alone.
That's right.
When you first started out.
Yeah. And then there was another thing I could point to, that part of the vision of this was to use certain influences whose rhythms are really tricky and really hard for, I mean, I don't care whether you're a classical musician, a jazz musician, or a pop musician, the rhythms are hard. And there is this idea, if every musician can be on its own track, then you have a little bit more flexibility to edit. And so what we did is we put people in isolation booths to make sure that only their part would appear on the track. And then we kind of assembled and edited later on, which eerily looked forward to the land of COVID, where the only way that now you can do things, well, I mean, now we're moving into sitting 10 feet apart, but for a while, you could just record people in their homes. And the second album that we're doing with this kind of music, we have already begun recording with, I mean, we had good musicians on Bing. Now the best musicians in the world who are all furloughed from the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, they're all eager to work. So it's a bonanza of talent.
It is indeed. You know, it also, I'm wondering if this sort of process harkens back for you, it certainly does for me, to the philosophy and the goals that Glenn Gould had when he started recording, exclusively recording, and he quit his performing career, and of course back then it was analog until the very end of his life, where he recorded digitally, the final recording of Goldberg Variations. But does that ring any bells to you?
Yeah, well, I am sympathetic. This idea that you know how you want music to sound, and there are all these things that get in the way. And for him, maybe he was disenchanted with having to perform live. I don't know the whole story about Glenn Gould, but he felt that he could make his statement just working alone in the studio. And yeah, in that way, it kind of chimes with my wanting to do this particular kind of music that would be a little bit difficult to just sight read with the whole band playing in the same room.
Okay, so let's talk about being. Actually, let's do this. Let's listen to the first. Unless you want to lead us into this at all, maybe we should just listen to the first movement,
and then I'll talk more about
yeah. Okay. has such a wonderful energy. There is something that, of course, I that's your signature in it. But talk to us a little bit about, first of all, the choice of instruments and the impetus behind the piece itself. What were your goals?
Well, yeah, I guess let's step back just a little bit.
Yeah.
I have this, when I observe human beings, we are creatures of habit, and as we get older, we fall more and more into our rituals or our habits, or we repeat ourselves. We fall into ruts, and we can't stop ourselves from getting old and dying, but we can keep ourselves fresh, I think, especially creatively. And one of the tools I've found to keep myself fresh is to find a style of music that I know nothing about. In some cases, I don't even like. I have to say that the project right before this was a violin concerto called Sky, and it is influenced by bluegrass music. I never knew very much about bluegrass music other than the Beverly Hillbillies theme. And so I decided that I would study a new style of music. And in that case, Tessa Lark, the violinist, comes from Kentucky, and she is classical genius, but she also plays bluegrass. So she could help teach me the style. And then I could learn to write in it and then impose my own structures and ways of putting musical forms together. And what I learned in that process is, even if I don't fully understand a new form, I mean, I'm no expert on bluegrass, even after all that study, but it's almost a kind of a misinterpretation of a style that brings about something new, and hopefully a fresh look, say for a violin concerto, of an old form. I mean, I was helped along by Tessa, because she could whip out her violin and play what I had written, and then say, oh, but that works much better, and oh, don't do that, and here are the string crossings that works better on banjo than it does on violin. So she really was my guide there. When that was finished, and we had a great time working together, I thought, well, let's pick another style. I mean, here we are, the mecca of clubs, Las Vegas, where they have EDM, electronic dance music. Believe it or not, I've never stepped foot in one of those clubs, even though this piece, Being, owes its influence, its seed, is a branch of electronic dance music called progressive house, which I knew nothing about, stumbled upon it on the internet. And I started listening, I started transcribing it, I started learning the shapes, and learned to write in that style. And then I imposed my own forms. You hear all that counterpoint in the woodwinds. You would never hear that in any kind of a progressive house or any house music at all. So that's all me. But you could probably hear in that excerpt we listened to, that F minor going to the D flat major 7 and then to the E flat sus. These are like really cheap, kind of like everyday run of the mill pop chords. Like, who would ever want to use? And I was thinking, isn't that great? It's just this really kind of boring harmony, but what can I do with it to make it come alive? And you often hear that in house music. Sometimes you don't hear any harmony at all, or just the suggestion of a harmony. But if you do, it's usually some really boring progression. But I like that. I think that that's a really interesting. We're too complicated in life. We have too many complicated chords. Use simple chords, I thought.
But so, it is. I just want to say one thing about that. In a way, those simple chords, those sort of very predictable chords, it's a blank canvas.
Well, that's one way of thinking about it. And yeah, I subscribe to that. And I think the simpler your materials, the more potential of going in any direction you want. And so, yes, it created a blank canvas where I could do almost anything. If I started getting into all kinds of complex harmonies, there would be too much attention to that, which I didn't want to give my attention to that part. So I wanted to finish by saying that I hesitate to even talk to the listeners of your program about progressive house, because anyone who really knows those forms will say, this has nothing to do with house music. You are out of your mind to make that claim. You are wrong. And if anyone who has gotten the CD, it has come out as a CD. My program note, I used to write lots of program notes because I have lots to say. I wrote one sentence: being is a continuous 43-minute composition in 9 parts, whose tempo is a consistent 126 beats per minute. Michael Torke. That's it. I don't want to make any statements about anything because one is always, quoted wrongly and all of that. But here we are, we're talking. And so I have to then emphasize that it's my misunderstanding of EDM that allowed me to scrape the cobwebs of my imagination out, try to do something fresh. And to the extent that I failed might be the extent in which I succeeded.
That's a good quote. I need to use that. But in a sense, though, Michael, I would argue that isn't this what composers have been doing in one way or another all along?
Sure. I mean, if you look at someone like Bach, he was the great synthesizer, taking Italian styles, taking other German and French styles, and bringing it all together. And then in the end, he did it better than so many of those Italian, I would argue, every one of those Italian and French composers. He emerged as the king, as the great synthesizer. Now, that doesn't mean that he wasn't original, because his way of putting pitches together is unlike any other composer, which is really an amazing thing when you think that there are 7 notes to the diatonic scale. Bach puts them together, and no music sounds like Bach. It is so. I still, it's a mystery why that music should work so well.
I remember, Michael, when you were in the midst of studying bluegrass music, transcribing bluegrass music, and turning it into that incredible violin concerto that you wrote for Tessa. And I think the same could be said for being in that synthesis of taking in this new style, whether it be bluegrass or EDM, progressive house music, that you can't help. You are a creative person, and it's interesting that the first thing you mentioned about being is that it was this impression using progressive house music of humans in a rut, and how we can still be creative and constantly reinvent ourselves, and using this form as an example.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I could talk about is that we always had natural instruments in the world. A flute you blow in, a string you draw the bow across. And along 60, 70 years ago, we invented new sounds, electronic sounds. And on the one hand, everyone was really excited. We have all these new sounds. And then on the other hand, everyone was saying, these are going to take the place of humans. Oh boy, this is the end of the world. In reality, if you look back at that history of electronic music, at its core, it was really trying to imitate the natural sounds in the end, even though it said, this is all different. And so my idea is to take live musicians and imitate electronic sounds. So it's just the opposite. I've come full circle. But like the game of telephone, you don't come back to the starting point. Because as you do these translations, or what I would even call mistranslations, you lose something, but something is gained. And that was kind of the conceptual idea behind being. These were all electronic sounds that I said, I think humans should play this stuff. And so you don't hear any percussion. There's always drum beats in electric. And I decided that I would assign all of the so-called drum beats that you would hear to like pizzicato in the strings, or all of those non-pitched events in electronic music now have pitches. And that, of course, creates a whole other kind of musical world by doing that kind of thing.
I think your answer, I encourage our viewers to comment and ask questions. And in essence, you are answering this question. How do you hear this music in your head? And I think that we are answering that question. It's music. You're using, in essence, you've used a form of music to inspire you to create something entirely your own and something new. So getting back to one of my first questions when after this, and we'll go on to the second movement. But so, what was your impetus in the music choice of instruments?
Oh, you're right. Well, I knew we would be going into a recording studio, so the idea of I'll hire an orchestra of 70 players, that would be really, just so prohibitively expensive. But then the idea that because I knew there was a lot of counterpoint, I couldn't just have like a string trio. And so I kind of just thought of, it isn't quite, the London Sinfonietta, that their idea was one of every instrument. It wasn't quite like that. I just said, well, okay, I want 5 strings. So you have a string quartet and a bass. I knew I wanted 2 pianos and 2 marimbas, because then they could have interlocking patterns, a lot of what Steve Reich does. And then I wanted woodwinds, which I had 2 soprano saxes, but other than that, it's very classical: flute, clarinet, oboe, bass clarinet, the 2 saxes, and bassoon. And then for the brass section, a lot of these chords are 3-note chords. So I wanted 3 horns and 3 trombones to play what we call the pads. And then 1 trumpet, that's all I needed. And he plays a lot of melodic stuff.
And in the end, when you talk a little bit, because it is incredibly difficult, interlocking, rhythmically challenging music, and while they were all recorded separately, what was the recording process like from the musician's point of view? What was that experience like?
Well, what we did is we would do 5 to 7 musicians at a time. And I was actually conducting. These booths have glass walls. And so we would start, and I would, we had a click track, but I was conducting phrasing more than anything and just talking about the style. And so we would record all those 5 or 7 people, and then we would spend a 6 to 9 hour session. And we had 4 of those. I think we did all the keyboards first, and then we did all the woodwinds, all the brass, and then we ended with the strings.
And why the 9 sections? Why 9?
Yeah, I don't know. A form emerges as the kind of the microcosm and the macrocosm are 2 things that kind of work together as you build a piece. And the overall form is that the first 4 parts, which they're seamless. I was going to release it as 1 track. And then right at the last minute, I thought, no, I should do 9 parts. So if people have places they want to jump to, it would be easy to get to. But my dream is, and someday I'm going to do this, I'm going to write a 50-minute piece that is just 1 track, 1 movement, and 1 idea. That's the ultimate goal. Here it took me 9 ideas. That's too many. I want 1 idea. But I'll tell you a little bit about the form, because there is like some logic to it all. That the first 4 movements each get more and more exciting, leading to a climax in the 4th part. Then the 5th part, even though it's the same tempo, it feels slower because I use 8th notes rather than 16th notes. And that's like the breath of the palate cleanser or just calming down. And then the 6th through the 9th movements also increase in the same way. And there's a kind of a 1-to-1 correspondence between movement 1 and movement 6, and then movement 2 and movement 7, and the climaxes of movement 4 and the climax of movement 9. That's the symmetry. So you have a big A, B, A1 form.
Is there something you'd like us to, in listening to the second part, or we can skip ahead, but I'm happy to play the next.
I like all the movements, but I think that the 3rd movement illustrates the extent in which the kind of difficult interlocking patterns of the woodwinds reach kind of like the zenith of how you have to play. You have to play rhythmically perfect for it to work. And I think that's best illustrated in the 3rd movement.
Let's skip ahead then to the third movement.
A good idea of what's going on, and
Yeah.
you can hear that the two key changes, and then I come all the way back around to the opening key of no sharps and no flats, a kind of a C major thing to end the movement.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a few questions or read a few comments from our audience here in a second, but I want to ask you, this of course is inspired by EDM, but your music for so long, and whether or not it was one comes for the other, your music has been associated with dance through one way or another for your entire career almost. Do you think there's a reason for that? One begets the other?
Well, I think that the maybe the prime impetus of the music. I mean, it's hard for one to talk about one's own music and what one's own kind of like what makes it work or not work. But I think it's the rhythmic thing. There's a rhythmic impulse that kind of gets me going. And that is very helpful in the world of dance because they need to dance to rhythm. And so from very early on, when I just moved to New York City Ballet, started working with Peter Martins together on 5 different projects. And that was my introduction to dance through one of the world's, great dance companies, but also it was the house that Balanchine formed. And so it was, and then from there, I kind of like worked hierarchically down the ladder through ballet and into modern dance, which I don't mean that hierarchy has any kind of political overtones that so many people think it does these days. I'm not saying that, but it was a great place, let's put it this way, simply to start. ones writing for dance at New York City Ballet. It could be that, yeah, that when you hear the rhythm, people want to move. And so that's helpful in the world of dance.
A couple of questions. One from one of our local heroes, Clint Holmes. He asks, is the intended listening audience classical or EDM or both? Or neither?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I have been not struggling with, because I'm not quite sure who the audience is. And we live in such fractured times anyway. I'm not even so sure that, like, my take on classical music necessarily goes hand in hand with a classical audience. For instance, your audience, Donato, whether they really want to come on a Saturday night to hear the kind of music that I want to write. I'm not even sure about that. I mean, I hope they do. And they responded well to a piece like Ash. So, to that extent, yes, but I could answer that in going back to the Bluegrass Concerto, because when Tessa and I worked, we thought, is this going to be for a classical soloist violinist or a bluegrass violinist? And that was a key question, because in bluegrass, you amplify the soloist. But in classical, you never do. Right. And so we had to make that decision. Well, there's nothing wrong with amplification, but Tessa has this great sound. And we said, let's design a concerto that doesn't have to be amplified. But by saying that meant that probably none of the great bluegrass musicians that we have, all the great fiddlers, they wouldn't really be able to play this piece. And then I realized, well, at heart, what I was really trying to do was revitalize classical music, not contribute to the wonderful world of bluegrass music, of which there are just so many great practitioners. So in a sense, I think it is a classical audience, even though I'm not so sure they're going to be interested. That is primarily because I mean, my dream was that some EDM producer would hear this and want to do a remix. And people are like, oh yeah, of course that's going to happen. No, it's never, you mark my words, that will never happen, because this music, EDM, really requires electronic sounds that you can really, that are hard edged and right. And when you hear a flute or an oboe making it, it's a very complex kind of bouquet of a waveform. And I had a friend put like a disco beat to the first movement that we listened to. I mean, it sounds silly. It sounds like switched on Bach or, roll over Beethoven or whatever that was in the 70s. It sounds really kind of hokey. And so that's never going to happen. And that said to me, well, maybe my audience is not the EDM. As much as I would like a popular audience, they may not come to this at all.
And of course, the strictness of having it be quarter note equals 126. Yeah. Yes, of course, we all strive. I can tell you that I strive my best to be exact as possible when a composer gives me a tempo marking, and try and keep it as
you're very good at that.
Unflinching in terms of, well, thank you. But in reality, if we were to anyone perform this live, there would be variations of tempo just by the very nature of live performance. And I'm curious if, I would love to perform this piece live, if nothing else, to experience that temporal, in a way, temporal dissonance of attempting to do something exact for 43 minutes, but never reaching that perfection.
Yeah, and that would be interesting, and that would probably be something, the aspirational in life. It makes life so beautiful. So what if a particular live performance isn't exact? The fact that you're trying to be exact and almost getting there is a very beautiful thing, a very moving thing. And here's what I have to say about that. I remember when Reich's 18 Musicians came out in the 70s. I remember when I first heard it, I didn't know what it was. I thought it was an electronic score, because the musicians were playing so accurately and it was such a weird sound. But the feeling was, okay, he's got Steve Reich musicians, these great musicians who rehearse for 2 years and then they record it. No one else is ever going to play this. Well, 15, 20 years later, a group at Eastman called Alarm Will Sound say, well, we can play it. and they're just a bunch of kids playing it just as well as Steve Reich and musicians. What happens is that once you get a recording out into the world, musicians, we learn by hearing. We actually learn by rote. And when you hear it, then you can imagine it. And all the younger generation come up and say, that's not hard. Let's do it. And so my feeling is, whether this will ever be performed live or not, I would love it that it would be someday, but it probably will be the younger musicians who come up and say, sure, what's the problem? You know?
It's the rite of spring phenomenon, right? You know, for so many years, the piece was deemed unplayable, but through
every orchestra plays it.
Yeah, and youth orchestras now perform it. You know,
that's right. That's right, and they do it well.
And not just they don't take a stab at it. They actually, like you said, they perform it well. Yeah. This might be a question for another time altogether, but someone asks, what words of advice would you give aspiring composers, and how does one achieve getting commissions?
Oh, that's like, how do you get a book deal in book publishing? I mean,
right.
How do you get a conducting job, Donato?
Well, once you find out, give me a call. You know.
Yeah, right. I think I can try to answer that. I think that, I mean, I've talked about this before, that for someone who's doing creative work, you have to learn how to think independently. And too often there is a herd mentality in the arts and in entertainment, where when something out here works, everyone rushes to it. You have, a certain movie that does really well, and every studio wants to make a movie just like it, because economically that sort of works. But that isn't really how art is made. Art is being at the forefront of the fault lines of culture. And the only way you can possibly do that is to think independently. And the secret in doing that is you have to develop a kind of measurement of value. The measuring stick has to be on the inside. Your self-worth is determined by your measuring stick. It's not determined by other people's measuring stick. And in that way, you form a kind of a confidence as an artistic voice. And you just do it. You become almost a little bit contrarian, and you forge your own path. And from that, if you do it well, you will have something unique to say. And that's where the demand comes from. And that's how you build a career.
And I don't know if you agree with this, Michael, but especially in today's, we have a luxury and I think it's an opportunity with technology that just didn't exist not that long ago, that my advice is to just continue to create, if it's and to get it out there, so that people know that you're there, so that you're producing, rather than waiting for someone to ask you to create something. You are always creating something, and occasionally someone will say, "Oh, I like that piece.
Yeah.
Can you write something for me like that?" Or I like what you did, with I heard about you conducting the Las Vegas Philharmonic. Can you know what I mean? There's something about always doing, always creating, regardless.
And I think that's a kind of an a priori thing, that if you're not always creating, then why be a composer? Right. I mean, it's almost like you just can't help yourself. Mm-hmm. And so if it's something that, like, okay, I guess, I want to be a composer, maybe I should start writing music. If it's that much of maybe find something else that you just naturally do.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back to being our next. What do you suggest we listen to next, Michael?
Well, it depends on how much time we have, but maybe just a little bit of the fifth movement, because that's so contrasting.
We'll get to the fifth movement, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Oh my.
There we go.
There we go. That gives just enough idea of how I'm dealing with the eighth note pulse a little bit more, and that the kind of additive melodic idea is so drawn out. So it has almost a feeling of a different tempo, even though it's still 126.
Well, I was going to say that it is deceptive, of course, and one could argue. One argues that and I also, like you, have not been to one of the clubs, EDM clubs, in my years living in Las Vegas, and I say that truthfully. I'm not trying to.
Yeah, I don't believe you.
But
maybe we could go.
But I will say that over the course of this piece, and I encourage everyone that hasn't had a chance to hear Being in its entirety to give the time, give the 50 minutes of your time to listen to it in its entirety, because it does take you on a journey that is, even though the quarter note pulse equals 126, it doesn't feel that way by any stretch of the imagination as you listen to it.
Oh, well, thank you.
How do you talk a little bit about how these combination of instruments created this type of sound, the orchestration of these instruments? How did you use that through this transformation of tempo of transformation, of rhythmic transformation?
Yeah, I mean, it's the secret of orchestration is how you double instruments. It really comes down to that. The idea that one instrument is playing something that the other instrument is playing will reinforce those overtones and make a richer sound. Oh, I thought I turned this off. Okay. And so if you were to analyze the score to this, it might be surprising, because it doesn't sound that way, how much I just double everything. I do it in a certain way that over, the 35 years of writing music, that are kind of advantageous ways of doubling. And then what you do is you do what the instruments do best. Like when brass play long sustained notes, it's so rich and so warm and so great, and it makes everyone else sound great. Brass aren't good at, brass are good at a lot of stuff, but to do really quick things that jump around, well, woodwinds can do that better. So give that to them. And strings, when they sustain, that's a sound unlike anything else. And so there are places where I just have sustaining strings, and it gives this flavor that's really different from the angularity of, say, the pianos or the marimbas.
Talk a little bit about, you mentioned this something you can't recreate in any other way, which is experience. Now we can talk a little bit about your education, who were some of the teachers you had that influenced you in one way or the other, or gave you advice that you still carry to this day. But this idea of learning on the job is really something, as a conductor, as a musician in an orchestra, as a composer, that's where you really learn your craft.
That's right. I think that's so true. And here's the advice here's what I would say I learned over those years is, it's funny, we're trained to listen as musicians, but we often don't listen to other people, especially when we're young and a little insecure. We say, well, I know the score, or I know how to write a cadence. And as you work with people, they'll say, well, did you ever consider this? Or let me try this on my instrument. If you really have ears to listen, you open up. People, other musicians, other people, even outside of music, have so much to offer. And that's where you really learn, is to keep your ears open. And it's hard to do when you're young and starting out, and easier when you develop kind of a spirit that so many people have so much to give in this world.
Well, you also mentioned something that is crucial to the arts, and you cannot avoid it. And it's also something that I think a lot of people who aren't in the arts don't understand as well, is that the arts in any form there must be collaboration. So you mentioned your producer. And that process of a composer and a recording producer, right, creating an album as you just did with Ying, while that's something that a lot of people don't know even exists. Or I'll say a conductor in an opera house. When you're conducting an opera, you have to have you're working in tandem with the stage director. You're working in tandem with the chorus master. It's really, art is always about collaboration. Yes. Not, of course, with other artists, but people that help create the art form itself.
Yeah, and that's why the pandemic hits us, the arts, so hard, especially music, because it is so collaborative. Music is about playing and making music together with an audience. There, all of those factors have to be together, and the pandemic wipes that all out. So, we really hope to get to the other side.
Well, I am hopeful. I think we're all hopeful and optimistic. Of course, we all have our days of thinking that it who knows when and how and in what form it will be in the near and distant future. But your music, Michael, will inspire us to get back to that point where we're performing your music, we're performing the music that we all love. I know that you're a frequent attendee of the Las Vegas Philharmonic, and I always so appreciate your emails the following day, your text message about, wow, I did, the tempo you took in the last movement of the Dvorak really kicked ass, or things like this. And we all look forward to those days, and I think that we do live. Las Vegas is a special community in that, and you've sensed this when we perform your music, and when you're in the audience hearing things that you haven't composed. There is a thirst and a need for live music in Las Vegas in a way that's not in every community. And when I walk out on stage, and it doesn't matter if I'm conducting a piece by Michael Torke or Beethoven or Brahms or Tchaikovsky or you name it. There's an enthusiasm that's palpable.
Yeah, and it's more than enthusiasm. It's a thirst for that kind of cultural nourishment that I feel more in Las Vegas than I even feel in New York. New York is a whole different scene, but more than any other American city. I'm not quite sure why that is. I play poker often at night, and there was this gentleman that I met, and then it turns out he wrote me an email like a month later, and he said, well, I was at the Philharmonic and I heard your piece. I didn't even know you were a composer. He said, but I was thinking not so much me, but him. He's some random poker player, but he's like, oh no, I wouldn't miss the Philharmonic. It's so important to this community. I swear you could have twice as many concerts, twice as many weekends, and you would still fill the house. And I think you should do it because people here want it.
They do. And I believe you, and we'll bring it back. We'll get there. Yes. Michael, it's been an hour, and it's been a joy talking about this incredible new recording of Ying. What a wonderful contribution, what a wonderful composition, and we've posted links to it here and there already, and just thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk about music together, and I'm glad to share this with you.
Everyone, take care. We'll see you next week. Bye.